We expect parents to love and care for their children, and that when they bring them into this world, that they will always protect them. But in February 2002, the murder of two brothers, aged 7 and 8, would send shockwaves around the world. This is the heartbreaking and tragic story of 8-year-old Brett and 7-year-old Brad Lee. Denise Williams grew up in a very volatile and abusive household at the hands of her stepfather in Tipton, West Midlands, before the family moved to West Bromwich. Her stepfather ran the household with an iron fist and would dish out regular violence towards her and her siblings and even her mother. By age 16, in 1991, desperate to get away from the constant physical and mental abuse in her household, Denise fled the home one night to move in with a man more than twice her age whom she had recently met in the Oaksdale Working Man's Club in West Bromwich. That man was 34-year-old Steve Wilson, a widowed father of 2. 34-year-old Steve love-bombed the young naive 16-year-old, barely out of school, piling on the compliments and picking her up from college in his flashy 4-wheel drive car, impressing all her college friends who were impressed that she was seeing an older, rich man with a car, as most of them at that age hadn't even learnt to drive yet or had a job. Steve wore fancy, expensive clothes and took Denise for expensive meals out, followed by telling a young, impressionable 16-year-old everything she wanted to hear. Steve brought Denise expensive gifts and took her out on shopping sprees, and told the young 16-year-old who had grown up in poverty that if she was with him, he'd treat her like a princess, look after her, and he told her she'd never ever have to worry about money or have to pay a bill, because he would give her the life that she deserved, a life of luxury. He also told her about his heroic career as an SAS sergeant. SAS is short for the Special Air Service, a special forces unit of the British Army that specialises in counter-terrorism, covert surveillance, hostage rescue, close combat fighting and special operations. The SAS is considered to be one of the best special forces units in the world. They are considered so elite that it has a rigorous selection process and is one of the hardest army branches to get into. Steve told Denise all about his tough SAS training, how he had been taught to kill a man with a single blow and how he had been trained to kill. He also told Denise about his top secret missions around the world, helping foreign governments rescue kidnapped victims using Kalashnikov guns, and about his heroic feats saving the lives of his fellow comrades by sticking his fingers in their bullet wounds to possibly help stem the blood. He told stories of being in war in Iraq and fighting terrorists in Northern Ireland, and showed off 2 machetes that he kept above his doorframe that he said were given to him by a foreign diplomat. He also told Denise about how whilst on top secret missions, he would earn £20,000 a time. Besotted and impressed by his amazing action-packed adventurous life and the princess treatment she was getting, Denise knew that Steve could protect her from her abusive stepfather and take her up out of the poverty she was living in at home. That is the reason why within 3 weeks of meeting him, Denise had fled home to move in with Steve and his 2 children, 14-year-old Conrad, who was only 2 years younger than her, and 12-year-old Stacy, who was 4 years younger. And despite warnings from her parents about what a nasty character Steve really was and how horribly he treated his first wife, Denise decided to stay with Steve, who was giving her the life she'd never had. Angry at her decision, her parents wanted nothing more to do with her, but an impressionable 16-year-old Denise was too happy with the new life she would have with 34-year-old divorced father Steve that she ignored everybody's warning, choosing to believe that Steve was a hard-working and changed man. Within weeks of moving into Steve's home, his true character started to emerge. First signs were that Steve tried to turn 16-year-old Denise into his first wife, Trisha, who had died at age 33 of cancer. He constantly talked about his deceased wife and had pictures of her all around the house, including a picture of her deceased in her coffin wearing her wedding dress that he kept on his bedside cabinet of the bed that he and Denise now shared. He kept all his deceased wife's clothes, which he convinced the 16-year-old to wear. He then convinced the teen to dye her hair and wear it in the same style that his deceased wife Trish had worn hers. Then he convinced her to drop out of her college course and distance herself from her friends and the rest of her family. Steve was very controlling and ruled his household with violence and intimidation. He was a very heavy drinker and turned violent when drunk, and he kept the household under his control by using fear tactics, telling them that because he was in the SAS, he was trained to kill. If Denise had thought that she jumped out of the frying pan and straight into the fire when she moved in with Steve, it was too late for regrets, because within 6 weeks of moving into Steve's home, Denise was pregnant. On July the 7th, 1993, 1 week before her 17th birthday, a heavily pregnant Denise married 34-year-old Stephen Wilson at Gretna Green in Scotland. A month after they married, whilst on a camping holiday in Devon, after Steve got very drunk, he beat up his 7-month pregnant newlywed wife for the first time, punching her in her belly and booting her in her back as she curled up in a fetal position, trying to protect their unborn child. The next day, when he sobered up a bit, he could not stop apologizing to her and blamed it on being in the SAS, how the SAS had messed up his head. Despite being apologetic, Steve would not take Denise to the hospital, afraid that people would know that he had beaten up his heavily pregnant teenage wife. He told her that if she could still feel the baby move, then the baby was okay. Despite the horrific beating she got whilst heavily pregnant, on Tuesday the 26th of October, 1993, baby Brett Michael Wilson was born at 2:40 a.m. at Sandwell General Hospital in the West Midlands, weighing in at 5 pounds and 14 ounces, a healthy baby. Denise became pregnant again almost immediately, and 10 months later, on the 25th of August 1994, she gave birth to another son, Brad Lee, weighing in at 6 pounds and 10 ounces. Denise was now an 18-year-old teenage mother of 2, with 2 stepchildren to look after, making her a mother of 4. Over the years, Steve's bullying, violent and controlling ways continued. He forced his older 2 children, Conrad and Stacy, and his wife Denise, to eat his dead wife's ashes, all the while telling his children that they were nothing like their mum, and if they ate her ashes, maybe her strong, brave character would rub off on them. He then picked big black lumps out of the ashes and told his kids that it was their deceased mum's cancer, and forced them to eat them, leaving them petrified that they now had cancer too because they had ate their mum's cancer. Steve forced his teenage wife to have fistfights with his teenage children, all the while insulting them, saying that they were weak and lightweights. One time, Steve had even stabbed his own son Conrad in the neck with a machete, and often made him skip school so that his teenage son could play pool like he had taught him, to win money which Steve took and spent on alcohol for himself. And if Conrad ever lost a game, he'd get whacked across the face when he got home. Once, Steve smashed the pool cue into his son Conrad's face. Steve had even goaded his son Conrad once into committing suicide, so Conrad swallowed paracetamols. All the while, Steve stood there laughing and goading him on, saying, "You were always a loser. Go on, kill yourself." It was Steve's younger daughter, Stacy, that called an ambulance for her brother, Conrad, saving his life. Steve forced his son, Conrad, to live in a shed in the bottom of his garden and forced him to pay him £60 a week rent. His daughter, Stacy, was forced to move into a caravan on the drive and also pay rent. There was no toilet or bathroom facilities, and they had to ask permission to use the toilets inside. Steve told them that he'd hunt them down and kill them if they ever left home, and how he had friends in high places from his days in the SAS that could track them down. So in fear of this, Conrad stayed in the shed at the bottom of the garden and Stacy in her caravan. At age 13, Steve forced his son Conrad to put his mother's body in the coffin after she died, and then made him and his 11-year-old sister Stacy pose in the funeral parlor in front of the coffin so he could take pictures. Despite their grief, the children were too scared to say no in case they were beaten by Steve. And at their mother's cremation, against the pleas of the crematorium staff, Steve forced his then 11-year-old daughter and 13-year-old son to watch their mother's coffin enter the furnace and burn. The children were both crying their eyes out, watching their mum's coffin burn, whilst their father Steve took photos of the whole thing, saying that it was important for them to see their mum's coffin burning. When it came to his teenage bride, Denise, she would not escape his cruelty either. Steve once headbutted Denise and broke her nose in 2 places, and one time he hacked off all her hair with his machete. Another time, Steve dragged Denise by the hair down the drive, scraping her face on the gravel all the way up to the house and kicking her every step of the way. At one time, Steve had even rammed his fingers so far up Denise's nose that her nose bled. Steve's drinking was out of control, and the more he drank, the more violence and cruelty he rained down on his family. Over the years, Steve had broken Denise's arm, held pillows over her head till she passed out, and put her in hospital multiple times. But she was afraid to leave, as he had told her multiple times that if she ever left, his friends in the SAS would track her down for him, and anywhere she went, he'd always find her. Despite all the domestic violence incidents towards Denise, Steve was never arrested, as she always dropped the charges. One day after a horrifyingly violent attack, Denise called the police, and when they turned up on the family's doorstep, Steve hid Denise in the bathroom behind the shower curtain and told her to be quiet. But police searched the house and found a bloodied and battered Denise and called an ambulance. Steve was eventually arrested, but he got his young daughter Stacy to go to the hospital and plead with Denise to drop the charges, saying that she didn't want her or Conrad to go into care. So Denise dropped the charges, saying that she had been jumped by men in hoodies, like Steve had told her to. When they travelled abroad on holiday, Steve told people that he was a member of the SAS and had top secret mafia links. And then he told stories of shooting enemies point blank range in the head. He also told them that he was in the British Mafia. In the summer of 1998, 5 years into their marriage, and 4 years after she had given birth to Bradley, Denise miscarried a little girl she didn't know she was pregnant with. Steve had told her, "God doesn't want you to carry girls because you're evil." Then he flushed the fetus down the toilet. He wouldn't allow Denise to use sanitary towels because he said his ex-wife Trish didn't, so Denise won't either. So Denise had to use folded up layers of toilet paper inside her underwear instead. Denise tried to run away and escape many times with the help of Women's Aid, taking the boys with her, but Steve always convinced her to come back, and because of Denise's troubled upbringing, she didn't want her boys growing up without a father, like she had, so she always eventually came back. One time, she escaped to a woman's refuge, and the next day, she saw Steve waiting outside the refuge in his Jeep. She had no idea how he managed to find them, but it gave weight to the statements he made about having secret contacts in the SAS that would always track her down if she ever tried to leave. Little Brett and Brad Lee were unable to escape the drunken wraths of their father too, and although he never hit them, he enforced SAS-style punishments on them, forcing them to stand with their arms outstretched and a Yellow Pages book balanced on their arms for 20 minutes at a time. He would also force Brett and Brad Lee to lie on their backs with their legs raised 2 inches off the ground for 10 minutes to toughen them up. Steve kept Brett and Brad Lee regimented by clicking his fingers, and they would immediately fall silent, straighten their backs and fold their arms, because their dad Steve said because of his years in the SAS, he'd only tolerate behaviour befitting of young officers in the elite forces. Brett and Brad Lee attended Grove Vale Junior and Infant School in Hampstead, Birmingham, and they were both in the same class. Brett was said to be the sensitive one of the two boys. Conrad, who was Steve's eldest son, eventually met a girl called Gemma, and they got married when he was 21, making Denise a step-grandmother at the age of 23. Before they were married, Steve put on his airs and graces and pretended to be a normal family. But after the wedding, the real Steve came out. On Conrad's wedding night, Steve beat up his son Conrad, splattering the bride Gemma's wedding dress with blood, all because the newlyweds had gone off to have a celebratory drink and hadn't invited Steve along. Steve, whose drinking and violent outbursts had gotten worse over the years, had also now become addicted to painkillers, taking up to 4 tablets an hour when he was in a party mood. Gemma had moved into the family home with her new husband Conrad, and Steve forced her to live in the garden shed alongside her new husband, even in the cold winters. He'd even started to force his daughter-in-law to dress exactly the same as his wife Denise, in matching outfits, different colours, to both look like his dead ex-wife Trish, and he forced them to both wear their hair like Trish's also. Gemma was also dragged into the abuse and did not escape Steve's domestic violence once she'd married into the household, and one day Steve smashed pint glasses and beer bottles onto the floor and forced Denise and his son's newlywed wife Gemma to walk over it with bare feet, mocking them all the while, saying that they were weak and would never make it into the SAS like he had. If they refused to do it, they'd get beaten up. Steve also forced Denise and Gemma to hold their arms out in front whilst holding 2 5-litre water containers, and if their arms dropped, he'd dig them in their stomachs. He even broke his daughter-in-law Gemma's eye socket once, during a drunken domestic violence rampage. But Gemma, who was young and too frightened to leave, stayed because she loved her husband Conrad and felt too trapped to leave. Denise had never known Steve to go out and work. He blamed her for having to give up his SAS missions, because Denise had told him that she was scared that he'd be killed one day by terrorists, leaving Brett and Brad Lee without a father. So Steve forced Denise into work to make back his lost income, even though when they first got together, he said he'd take care of her and she'd never have to work. So Denise got a job in a chip shop, working 5 days a week, working from noon till midnight, while Steve stayed at home and drunk Denise's earnings away. But Steve eventually got jealous of Denise's working relationship with her chip shop boss, even though it was nothing more than a boss and worker relationship, and Steve beat up Denise's boss, then smashed all the windows of the boss's BMW, causing Denise to lose her job. He also forced her to get a paper round. Gemma and Conrad eventually gave birth to a baby girl they called Lauren, and they were forced to stay in the cold shed at the bottom of the garden with their new baby. Gemma was forced to go back to work at a chip shop she worked at within a fortnight of giving birth, as Steve said that he was raising the rent of the shed as there was now a new baby. Unable to take any more of Steve's tyranny, Gemma fled the house and left soon after, taking her baby with her. Gemma's mum, unaware of the abuse and torture her daughter had been going through, as Gemma had hid it from her parents, came to the house the day after Gemma fled to try to patch things up for the sake of the new baby. And at first Steve put on the charm, and then he began drinking. And when Gemma's grandmother, who did not like Steve because of the abusive phone calls he made to their home at 1 o'clock in the morning demanding to know where Gemma was, when the grandmother turned up on the doorstep a few hours later to see where her daughter was and gave Steve a piece of her mind for everything he'd done to her granddaughter Gemma, the violent and drunk Steve pushed the frail pensioner to the ground, then goaded and beat up Gemma's mother, raining kicks and punches, stamping on Gemma's mother's head and booting her in the face, bruising her face, swallowing her lip and shattering her nose. Gemma never came back, and the next day she served Conrad with divorce papers. Fed up with all the violence and abuse, both of Steve's oldest children, Conrad and Stacy, snuck away in the night and never came back. Stacy never spoke to her father again. Steve blamed Denise for everybody leaving the home and said that she'd have to make up for the loss of rent money from both of his oldest children and Gemma. So he then forced her to go out and earn money in a job that he'd arranged for her at a massage parlor that gave extras. 5 days a week, Denise worked from 11 a.m. till 8 p.m. in the massage parlor/brothel, and he forced her to hand over every single penny of her earnings. She wasn't allowed to keep any of it. One time, when she hadn't had enough clients at the massage parlor/brothel, Steve drove Denise to Cheddar Road in Balsall Heath, Birmingham, a known red light district. He drove her there with Brett and Bradley in the back of the car asleep and waited nearby to make sure she took on punters. He then turned the shed at the bottom of the garden, which was previously his oldest son Conrad's home, into a brothel and forced Denise to take on paying clients. At one point, Denise was bringing home £1,000 a night, but Steve took it all and spent it on alcohol. He brought himself diamond rings and antique guns to show off. He also brought alloys for his car and a gym membership at David Lloyd's gym, a luxury state-of-the-art gym that is also considered world-class. Steve also spent Denise's earnings on paying for prostitutes and in brothels, including the brothel that Denise worked at. Humiliated, abused, and with her self-esteem broken down, Denise could take no more. She decided she was going to leave Steve and make her escape once and for all, but it would have to be planned and it would have to be in secret. On Saturday the 2nd of February 2002, Denise spent the whole day carrying on as usual and acting as if everything was normal, but in her mind she'd planned to leave that night. That evening, Steve drank himself into a drunken stupor and passed out at 3 a.m. in the morning. Denise got up and went to wake her boys, Brett and Bradley, to sneak them out into the waiting taxi outside. But upon entering Brett and Bradley's room, there was Steve laying down in a drunken stupor on the floor in the boys' bedroom. Fearing what Steve would do to her if he woke up, Denise made the heartbreaking decision to leave without her boys and went alone to stay with a friend. The next day, when Steve realized Denise had left him, he rang Denise's phone and cried down the phone, begging her back and promised to stop drinking. But Denise had heard it all before and was determined this time to never go back. Undeterred, Steve got the boys, Brett and Bradley, to call their mother's phone, saying they missed her and asking her when she was coming home. Denise told them that she planned on finding them a place to live with her and then she'd come back for them. She agreed to meet up with the boys a few days later, and it was agreed that Denise would meet her sons at McDonald's in West Bromwich at 6 p.m. on the 6th of February, which was 4 days after Denise had fled the home. On the day they met up in McDonald's, Brett and Bradley were so excited and happy to see their mother. And as they sat eating their chicken nuggets Happy Meal, they told their mother Denise how much they loved and missed her. But Denise noticed that Steve just sat there staring straight ahead whilst not saying a word the whole time. After McDonald's, Steve convinced Denise to walk her sons to the car, and once there, he convinced her to get in the car for a cigarette, and although Denise didn't smoke, she got in the car and took a cigarette anyway, as she was starting to feel fearful of the anger she saw simmering in Steve's eyes. As Denise sat in the car, she eventually turned and kissed her sons, promising to take them to the pantomime that week, something they were excited about and looking forward to. When Denise went to get out the car, Steve quickly and suddenly grabbed her in a headlock and started punching her in the face repeatedly. Brett and Bradley looked on, scared and terrified, and began calling out, "Mummy, Mummy, are you okay? Daddy, stop hurting Mummy." Panicked, Denise pressed down on the car horn, the sound making Steve loosen his vice-like grip off her head, and Denise quickly jumped out of the car. Steve then tried to run Denise over with his Jeep, but Denise managed to get away. Steve drove alongside her, rolled down his car window, laughed sarcastically and asked her, "Are you all right?" He then sped off laughing like a madman. It was 7:20 p.m. Denise got back on the tram at West Bromwich to return to the friend's house she was staying at in Bilston, and 10 minutes later she received a call on her mobile phone. It was Steve. At first he was heavy breathing down the phone, and then he spoke in a half whisper and said 10 words that would change Denise's life forever. He said, "I've killed the kids. Now I'm going to kill myself." He then hung up the phone. Denise immediately made her way to Bilston Police Station, and when the police saw her face all beaten up, they immediately took her to West Bromwich Police Station. Unbeknown to Denise, Steve had already called the emergency services, telling them that he was going to kill his 2 sons, so the police were already searching for him. By 10 p.m, a police sergeant came into the room with 2 female police officers and told Denise that her 2 sons had been found, but unfortunately, they were both dead. Steve had gone through on his promise. Feeling numb, disbelief and shock, Denise screamed out, "No, he's really done that. He's killed the kids. Brett and Bradley. No, he hasn't. Please say no." Then out of utter shock and disbelief, Denise then slapped the police sergeant across his face, then blacked out. The incident was all over the media, and over the next few days, the full details of the horror that occurred came out. After Steve had driven off laughing like a madman, he called the police and told them that he'd just killed his kids. Desperate to locate Steve and his young sons, the police asked for his whereabouts, and he told them that he was in Bewdley in Worcester. Then he switched off his phone to stop the police from being able to track him down. Steve had actually made 3 999 calls to emergency services, lasting a total of 90 minutes. The first call was at 8:48 p.m, where he told the emergency operator, "She has left. That's why I have done it. I have stabbed my kids and now I will stab myself and we'll go together." In another call, he told the emergency services, "I stabbed my sons in the neck with a screwdriver. I couldn't find my heart. Why can't I fucking die?" And in a final call, he said, "They are dead in the car. I am loving them. I have got my arms around them. I am getting weak now. I have stabbed myself in the throat 6 times and all down my arms. She has got what she wants now. I have told her the children are dead." Steve had also phoned his oldest son Conrad and said, "Sorry mate for killing your brothers." He then went into detail about how he had killed his young sons and also told Conrad how he'd beaten up their mother, Denise. During the 90 minutes that Steve had spoken to the emergency operators, the 999 call handlers had pleaded with him to tell them his whereabouts so that they could try and help save Brett and Brad Lee. But Steve had repeatedly lied to them, first saying that he was in Bewdley, just under an hour's drive away. Then he told them he was in Wyre Forest in Worcester, just over an hour's drive away. Police searched for more than an hour to try and find the boys, even using a helicopter. And when the helicopter finally located Steve's car, he'd actually driven just 14 minutes down the road to Hilltop Golf Course in Handsworth. Upon seeing the helicopter and police cars approaching him, Steve quickly but superficially stabbed himself in the chest. There were no other stab wounds. He had not stabbed himself in the neck 6 times or all down his arms like he had told the emergency call operators. WPC Karen Huxley of West Bromwich Police Station was the first on the scene. When the car was found, there was no headlights on and the doors were closed. Steve was in the car with his phone to his ear and his other hand on the chest of his youngest child, Brad Lee. Brett was lying face down with his body and shoulders on the seat and in a kneeling position. Steve was taken out of the car and arrested and taken to Sandwell General Hospital under police guard. Nothing could be done to save Brett and Brad Lee. At the hospital, Steve confessed what he'd done to the nurses. Sheila Wilkinson, the nurse who had treated him, said that he was in pain and kept talking in a continuous monologue, saying his wife was a prostitute. He asked the nurse to hold his hand because he was scared and in pain. So she held his hand. Then he told her he'd done something silly. He then went on about his first wife dying of cancer. The post-mortem revealed that Steve had slashed 7-year-old Bradley's throat with a craft knife, and when the knife had broken off in his neck, Steve then used a screwdriver to finish him off. 8-year-old Brett, who had witnessed it all, was terrified and had tried to fight back, but he was only 8 and didn't stand a chance. Brett also had bruising to the face and a bust lip. He had struggled to get out of the car. There was also evidence that Brett had been so terrified he'd vomited. He was then stabbed in the neck with the same screwdriver by his father. Brett and Bradley's funeral was held 3 weeks after their murders at Perry Bar Crematorium on Friday the 1st of March 2002. The funeral service led by Reverend Robert Brindley. Their coffins were carried by horse and carriage, and they had white coffins with wreaths spelling out their names in red and white carnations. The school the 2 boys had attended, Grove Vale Primary School, was closed for the day so that classmates and teachers could pay their last respects. The wake was held at the Oliver Cromwell Inn in West Bromwich. Steve Wilson claimed diminished responsibility, but despite this, he was declared fit for trial. Steve was then transferred to Winson Green Prison on remand, where prisoners despised him for what he'd done to his sons Brett and Brad Lee. Steve had boiling water thrown over him and feces put in his food. Whilst on remand, Steve became a born-again Christian, and when he was transferred to Blakenhurst Prison near Redditch in Worcester, he attempted suicide by slashing his throat and neck with a razor blade, saying I want to be with my kids. The trial began at Birmingham Crown Court on Wednesday the 10th of March 2003, just over a year after the murders. During the trial, the truth about Steve's true dark character was revealed. It turns out that Steve was never a member of the SAS and hadn't been trained to kill at all. The fear tactic he had used on his family to keep them afraid and under his control for years. He had only served 138 days in the regular army 25 years earlier before being kicked out. And the £20,000 a time he claimed he got for going on top missions for the government was also a lie, since he'd never been in the SAS. Instead, he had been acting flashy and living off his first wife Trish's £42,000 life insurance money, blowing most of it on alcohol, cars and flashy holidays. He'd left nothing for his and Trish's children, Conrad and Stacey. A family friend had told reporters when Steve's first wife Trish died of cancer in 1992, aged 33, you could call it a merciful release. The surgeon who had treated Steve in the hospital after he'd stabbed himself in the chest after killing his sons, Dr. David Gorovich, took the stand and told the court that Steve's wounds were superficial because he didn't have not one stitch. Dr. David Gorovich also said none of his injuries caused any medical concern. The screwdriver had missed all vital organs and there was no significant blood loss, so I didn't do anything but clean his wound. Home Office pathologist Dr. Peter Ackland was called to the stand and he told the court the boy's injuries were devastating. The attacker deliberately aimed for the vital structures of the neck. The carotid arteries had been damaged, causing the boys to bleed to death. Brett's injuries were consistent with being restrained. Both boys had died within 5 to 6 minutes. During the description of the devastation Steve had caused to his sons, he simply stared ahead, devoid of any emotion. Steve took the stand and claimed that he had been the victim of domestic abuse from Denise for the past 10 years and that it was she who had beat him up and not the other way around, and that on the day of the murder she had caused her own black eye by punching herself, then blaming him, and that he had only acted in self-defense. Under cross-examination, the barrister asked, how did 7-stone Denise beat up and abuse 14 to 18-stone Steve during their 10-year marriage? Denise's old chip shop boss was called as a witness to testify about the day Steve had beaten him up and smashed out all of his car windows. Steve's older children, Conrad and Stacey, gave evidence on the stand, testifying about the years of bullying, violence and abuse at the hands of their father, and how everyone in the household lived in fear of him, with Conrad telling the courts, yes, when questioned if he hated his dad. The 399 emergency calls that Steve had made after he'd stabbed his sons were played to the court, and upon hearing them, everyone in the courtroom was distressed. Everyone except Steve, who sat staring straight ahead, expressionless throughout. When Steve was cross-examined, he blamed the murders on the boy's mother, Denise, saying that Denise had raided the safe at the massage parlour/brothel she had worked at and stole thousands of pounds in drugs and then ran off, leaving Albanian pimps angry and wanting revenge. Steve said that on the night of the murder, masked Albanian pimps forced him at gunpoint to Hilltop Golf Course. There they beat up his 8-year-old son Brett, whilst asking Steve where the stolen money and drugs were that his wife stole. They then stabbed him and his 2 boys. Steve claimed that the brothel owner called him before the so-called kidnapping and murder, saying, "Do you think your kids are safe at school?" They then tracked him down. Steve went on to say that during the time the masked Albanian pimps were harming his sons, he watched on in horror, helplessly, as his son screamed, "Help me, Daddy," while he felt guilty and ashamed that he couldn't help them. During the 20-minute interrogation on the stand, Steve cried as he answered the barrister's questions and sat clutching his crucifix throughout the trial and shaking his head in denial. The barrister questioning him remarked, "There were no other tire marks of any other car driven by Albanian gangsters that forced and followed you to Hilltop Course. Only yours." Steve responded, "The killers are still out there. I have spent the last 12 months in prison. I want the killers brought to justice. I am on a wing full of murderers, rapists and child molesters, and I am not like them." The jury of 6 men and 6 women took less than an hour of deliberation to find Steve Wilson guilty of double murder. And on Tuesday the 25th of March 2003, Stephen Wilson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Upon sentencing, Judge Justice Anthony Hughes told Steve, "You took those boys' lives to revenge yourself on your wife. They were 7 and 8, and the manner in which you killed them was brutal. It was a dreadful and wicked thing to do." Steve interrupted the judge to shout out, "I did not kill my boys." The judge went on, "Nobody who heard you give evidence could believe more than an occasional word. There must be no mistake. Your hands took these boys' lives, and the responsibility is yours." The judge ordered for Steve's Daihatsu Jeep that he had murdered his sons in to be crushed. Upon leaving court, Steve's daughter Stacy came out beaming and punched the air in joy. Steve's parents gave a statement saying, "We are disgusted, appalled and ashamed of Stephen committing this cowardly act against 2 small children, but we are not surprised. He is an evil, lying, controlling, manipulative and devious bully who is power and money mad. Everyone has been his victim over the years. We have been in fear for our lives from the threats of violence." The parents added that they'd never ever met their grandsons Brett and Bradley and didn't even know what they looked like until the papers printed their photos, adding that they'd also been cut off from Conrad and Stacy when they were around 4 and 5. Steve's parents went on to say, "We are mourning the deaths of Brett and Bradley with deep emotions. We hope he will be locked away for the remainder of his life. Then everybody can feel safe from his tyranny." Steve's mother told in an interview that Steve had been a bastard from age 3 when he threw a kettle at her. At age 15, he had held a knife to his own mother's throat. Steve's mother had finally taken an injunction out on him as an adult after he smashed all the windows in her house because she'd had a party there and didn't invite him. On the same day that Steve had been sentenced to life in prison, a 38-year-old builder by the name of Keith Young from Wales killed his 4 young sons, all under the age of 8, in his car in a North Wales beauty spot. It has been speculated that he could have been inspired by Steve Wilson. Denise met a 38-year-old man named Kevin Griffiths, an old friend who offered a shoulder to cry on and a listening ear, and it quickly blossomed into something more. Steve heard about it from prison and sent Keith a poisoned pen letter from his prison cell, warning Kevin to stay away from her because she wasn't to be trusted and was evil. In the poison letter, Steve again blamed Denise for the murders of her sons, saying that she had arranged for Albanian gangsters to kill their sons who had been his world. The letter was ignored and did not break the couple like Steve had hoped. And weeks after meeting Keith, Denise was pregnant, giving birth just before the murder trial on the 13th of November 2002 to a son she called Owen, who was born in the same hospital as her first 2 sons, Brett and Bradley. Kevin was a warm and loving, loyal partner, nothing at all like Steve, and only made Denise feel loved and secure. Denise rebuilt her shattered life after the funeral and got a job while Kevin rebuilt her shattered heart. And on the 16th of July, 2005, Denise's birthday, the couple got married in what Denise described as a dream wedding, saying she'd never felt so special. They would go on to have 2 more children, a daughter, Katie Marie, born on the 23rd of October 2006, and Grace Ivy, born on the 14th of June 2010. Five days into his life sentence, on Sunday the 30th of March 2003, at 12 p.m, Steve Wilson, aged 44, was found hanging in his prison cell by his shoelaces at Blakenhurst Prison. He had left a note on his cell window which read, "Gone to bed." The note also protested his innocence. Efforts were made to resuscitate him, but there was no sign of life. Steve had told inmates that if he was to get convicted, they would have to take him out in a box. Comments made by his former neighbours and people who knew him were, "I have known him since he was a little boy in 1966. He was a horrible kid. My kids were always petrified of going out when he was around. He was just a nasty, evil man, and I'm so glad we've seen the last of him." Another person commented, "Personally, I would have handed him the rope. He was a nasty piece of work." Whilst another person said, "Steve liked to portray himself as a hard man, but he was a chicken. He wouldn't have been able to hack prison life. It would have been too much for him, given the time he would have to spend there. I fully expected him to commit suicide." Nobody came to claim Steve Wilson's body, so it lay on the morgue slab for 4 days and had to be identified by prison service fingertip records. Eventually, an anonymous donor, suspected to be Steve's brother Martin, paid the £213 fee for a pauper's grave burial. On the day of Steve's burial, there was no church service. He was buried in the cheapest coffin available, and there were no flowers or a wake afterwards. Nobody turned up to Steve's funeral except for 2 people, his son Conrad and his brother Martin, who only stayed for 5 minutes to see the coffin get lowered into the ground and then left. On his way out to the cemetery, Steve's brother Martin told a waiting reporter, "It is finished and done now. I felt it was my place to finish it. It has come to an end now." Grove Vale Primary School in Great Barr, where Brett and Bradley attended, unveiled a memory bench and playground in the boys' honour. A report was done after Brett and Bradley's tragic death, which criticised the police, social services and women's refuges for not doing enough to help prevent the tragedy. The report said that a year before the killings, sightings of bruises were seen on Denise, and police were aware of numerous call-outs for domestic violence, but Brett and Bradley were not classed as at risk. Because of Steve's previous threats to kill, social services were involved, and Brett and Bradley's school had reported witnessing scenes of violence. When social services paid the home a visit, they noted that Steve's older children, Conrad and Stacy, were sleeping in the garden shed and also a caravan on the property. There had been reports from neighbours who had heard the abuse and called the police, but nothing was ever done. The report concluded that the issue of child safety was lost because agencies concentrated on the adults instead. Going off of the findings of this report, new policies were introduced to guard against this type of tragedy ever happening again.